All right, I want to welcome everyone to class. As we know, we're going to be covering Chapter 4, and Chapter 4, as you know, focuses on socialization. Now, this chapter is important, particularly if you are interested or if you're interested in learning about who you are as an individual. The previous chapter that we covered, Chapter 3, focuses on culture, and culture, as we said before, influences us as all of us as individuals. But this chapter focuses on the micro level in terms of what makes us who we are as individuals. And you're going to see here that, we become who we are as individuals through the process of socialization. So this chapter is very important in terms of finding out who we are. As always, make sure you guys are focused on the objectives. Please remember here that these objectives are what you need to know for our assignment, for our exam. So when you're reading the chapter, make sure you focus and review each of these objectives. Now we're going to try to cover a lot of these objectives, the ones that we do not cover on this presentation. Obviously, you're still responsible for doing it. All right, now let's get into what socialization is. As it says here, socialization is the lifelong process of social interactions through which we as individuals acquire a sense of ourselves, our identity, our social skills, and all these skills here are needed for survival. So socialization is very important. Without proper socialization, we become very dysfunctional. Now, you can think about socialization as, again, a process where we become who we are as individuals. And as I said earlier, without proper socialization, we become, very dysfunctional. And there have been a few examples of individuals who were not properly socialized. I think our textbook talks about a couple of them. One of them was Jeannie, and this was a young girl who, for the first 12 or 13 years of her life, she was locked into a room, and she did not have a lot of interactions with human beings. She did not have, her parents didn't talk to her. The only time they interacted with her was when they were giving her food. And when she was found, she was almost animalistic. She was almost like an animal. She couldn't speak, she couldn't walk, and it was a very sad situation. And so the point of this story shows us how important socialization is. And so socialization helps us become who we are as individuals. And without it, then we can become very dysfunctional. Now, one of the questions that we focus on in socialization is what makes us who we are? Is it nature or is it nurture? Now, the nature argument says that we are who we are because of our biology and our genes. Our genetic makeup is what makes us who we are. So, for example, if you define yourself as a kind person, you would say, a nature argument would say that you are kind because you have some sort of kind genetics that was passed on from parent to you, right? And so we are who we are because of our biology and our genetic makeup. The nature or the nurture argument says that we are who we are because of how we are raised, our environment. And so again, if you are raised in an environment that promotes the idea that you're supposed to be a nice person or you're supposed to be a kind person, then you're going to become that person. So again, it is an argument that we are who we are because of how we were raised, our social environment. Now, and this is one of the questions of this chapter. What makes you who you are? And I want you to take some time here to think about what makes you who you are as an individual. So for example, if you define yourself as kind or caring or nice, what role did nature and nurture play in making you who you are? And so this is where you think about you yourself and you yourself as an individual. So for example, if you're a selfish person or if you define yourself as selfish, then you can think about, why am I selfish? Is it because of nature, meaning that is it because of my genetic inheritance, or is it nurture? Was I raised to be selfish? And so this is where you take some time to think about who you are as an individual. All right, now, according to most researchers, if you ask most social scientists, they would argue that most or human beings are a combination of nature and nurture. we're still not sure which one of these forces are more important, or if any of them is more important. But this is some of the conclusions that some of researchers have argued, that both nature and nurture work to make us who we are as individuals. All right, now what we're going to try to do now is we're going to focus on one sociological or psychological theory in terms of what makes us who we are as individuals. And then we're going to get into some sociological theories. Now, the first psychological theories that we're going to focus on is from Sigmund Freud, and I'm sure you guys have taken psychology classes, and you guys probably have heard about Mr. Freud here. And his argument here is that human behavior and personality originates from unconscious forces within the individual. And so this is, akin to, or this is similar to a lot of these nature arguments. And what Freud argues here is that human beings have two basic tendencies. All human beings have two basic tendencies. Number one is the urge to survive, and number two is the urge to procreate, or to make babies, basically. And so according to Freud, these are two basic tendencies that all human beings have. Again, the urge to survive, and number two, the urge to procreate. Now, make sure you understand the different personality states that we as human beings have according to Freud. And Freud argues here that human beings have three states: the id, the ego, and the superego. And again, make sure you understand each of these states of our personality. Now, the id is the component of our personality that includes all our basic biological drives. And one of the most important aspects of the id is that it demands immediate gratification. And what's interesting about the id is that the id is the only part of our personality that is actually present from birth. It is entirely unconscious. And again, this is the only part of our personality that we actually inherit when we are born. This is present from birth. And again, you can think about the id as driven by a pleasure principle, and it strives for immediate gratification. So this is why when you have a child and they want anything, they're going to cry until they get it, right? Because they cannot control themselves. And, according to Freud, a child cries when they want something because of their id. And the id is, like I said, the only part of our personality that kids or human beings are born with. Now, the second part of our personality, of our human development, is what Freud refers to as the ego. Now, the ego, as it says here, is the rational, reality-oriented part of our personality, and the ego starts to develop within the first 3 years of a child's life. And the most important function of the ego is in trying to control the impulses of the id. And in doing so, it helps the id. It helps that part of our personality express in a more acceptable manner. Because, just imagine if you are an individual and you are totally and wholly controlled by the id, right? Just imagine how selfish, how self-absorbed, you would be. And so the ego, the purpose of the ego is trying to control that selfish aspects of the id that it demands immediate gratification. And so this is one of the most important aspects when we're grown, and when we're social. Now, the other aspect of our personality is what Freud refers to as the superego. Now, this is where we start to develop our morals and values. And the superego, according to Freud, start to emerge around age 5. Now, these are, the morals and values that we get from our parents. And again, this is part of socialization. So when we are interacting with our parents or whoever is raising us, we learn these values and morals. And this is obviously, these values and morals are very important in the development of who we are as individuals. And according to Freud here, if children are properly socialized, they will become well-functioning members of society. But if they're not properly socialized, if they don't have a proper developed ego, and if they don't have a properly developed superego, then they can become monsters, essentially, right? And so we need these different aspects of our personality to make us well-functioning human beings, productive human beings in society. All right, now what we're going to do is we're going to get into some of the sociological theories of human development. Now, the first sociological theory of human development is from Charles Cooley, and this is part of what is defined as the looking-glass self. Now, the looking-glass self is the perception of who we are is largely based on how we think other people view us. So again, the idea here is that the perception, how I view myself, is a reflection of how I think other people view me. So again, it is the idea here that if I view myself as a kind person, it is because other people view me as kind, and I have inherited or I have internalized that notion or that view of myself. So our personality, essentially, our view of ourselves is based on our social interactions with other people, right? Now, there are three aspects to the looking-glass self, and we're going to cover each of them, and I'm going to use an example to ensure, hopefully ensure that you understand each of these aspects. Now, the first part of our personality, according to Charles Cooley, and again, this is part of the looking-glass self, is we imagine how we present ourselves to other people. Now, let's use the example of this young girl, and you can see her in the picture on the right. And let's say she's a college student, and she's took a test, and she's wondering if she's smart enough to pass this class. So again, she wonders if she's smart enough. So this is the first part of the looking-glass self. We imagine how we present ourselves to other people. I wonder if I'm smart. I wonder if people think I'm smart, essentially. So again, she imagines how she presents ourselves to other people. So I wonder if people think I'm smart. I wonder if my friends think I'm smart, and so forth and so on. The second aspect of the looking-glass self is we imagine other people's judgments about us. So if we use the same example of this young girl here, she would say to herself, well, my friends probably think I'm smart because they always ask me for help, or my friends think I'm smart because they always copy from my paper, or whatever the case may be, right? So we imagine how other people view us. So again, if we use the examples of this young girl, she would say, well, my friends probably think I'm smart because they always tell me that I'm smart, or they always treat me like I'm smart, or they always ask me for my advice. Now, the last part of this theory is that we develop either a positive or negative self-concept of ourselves based on other people's judgments about us. So again, this young girl would say, yes, I am smart because my friends and family think that I'm smart. Or I am smart because my teacher told me that I'm smart. Or I'm smart because, my boyfriend says that I'm smart. So again, it is the idea that our perception, how we view ourselves, is a reflection of how we think other people view us. So again, on the other hand, if we think other people view us as dumb, then we may more than likely view ourselves or start to view ourselves as dumb. And so it is the looking-glass self states that our perception of ourselves is a reflection of how we think other people view us. All right, let's get into the other theorist in terms of human development, and that is George Herbert Mead. Now, Mead also believes that our personality is created through social interactions, and the term that he uses is what is defined as role taken. And role taken is a process by which a person mentally assumes the role of another in order to understand that person's point of view. Now, what's interesting here is as kids go through this process of role taking, and all kids, all human beings essentially go through these processes here. As they go through these processes of role taking, their sense of self eventually develops. So this role taking process is a very crucial part of developing who we are as individuals. And what we're going to do, we're going to talk about several aspects of, or several stages in this role taking process. Now, the first stage is what is defined as the preparatory stage. Now, this is from birth up until around age 3. Now, this is where children begin to mimic or imitate what they see around them. And in this stage, children are preparing for role taking. They haven't began the process, but they're just preparing to engage in this process. And again, again, this is where you see these kids making very funny faces, and again, they tend to imitate what they see around them. A lot of these kids, or I would imagine most of them, if not all of them, really have no idea what these images or what these expressions mean. They just mimic or imitate what they see around them. And this is, again, the first stage, the preparatory stage. Now, the second stage in this process is what is defined as the play stage. Now, this stage goes from around age 3 to 5, and this is where children start to use language and symbols. They also start to take on roles. And this is where they start to pretend or play to be like mommy or daddy. So this is where they're actually taking on roles of other people. So they're pretending to be like mommy, they're pretending to be like dad. And you can see in the picture on the right with the young girl pretending to be like her mother. Now, what's interesting about this stage is that these kids don't yet see role taking as something that they have to do. They think other people do it, but they don't realize yet that they have to do it for themselves as they get older. So again, this is where they start to take on these roles. And again, this is the play stage. Now, in the game stage, this is a very important stage. This, evolves after age 5 and up. Now, this is where children start to understand not only their roles, but they also start to understand the roles of others around them, right? And they start to understand that they themselves have a role to play in this whole society, essentially. So this is where these kids start to become concerned about the demands and the expectations of others in the larger society. And so by doing this, a sense of, they start to develop a sense of themselves. And so this stage is a very important stage in the development of who we are as individuals, because before these stages, these kids didn't understand who they are. They didn't have a solid foundation. In the play stage, for example, they didn't understand that they themselves have to play a role. But when they get into the game stage, when they start to interact with other people, particularly people around their own ages, they start to understand that not only do I have a role to play, but these people around me have a role to play. And they start to see that, there are expectations within the larger society, expectations that I have to sometimes fulfill in many ways. And so this is where a sense of themselves, a sense of identity starts to develop. So the game stage is a very important stage in the development of who we are as individuals. All right, now what we're going to talk about now, and this is going to be the last part of this chapter, we're going to talk about agents of socialization. We're going to talk about several agents of socialization. First of all, we're going to talk about what exactly agents of socialization is, and we're going to talk about specific examples of agents of socialization. All right, so agents of socialization, these are persons or groups or institutions that teach us to become who we are and teach us to participate in society. So agent socialization, a very simple way to think about agent socialization, these are the places and the spaces where we learn to become who we are as individuals. Now, we know that there are several important agent socialization that most people encounter in their life. One of the most important agent of socialization, and please remember that the most important agent of socialization is the family. And the family is where we learn a lot of our values, a lot of our norms, our expectations, and so forth and so on. So the family is extremely influential in who we are. And it's not a coincidence that most of our values and norms are similar in many ways to that of our families. Schools are also very important because we know that we spend a lot of times in schools, and if you think about it, schools are one of the first places and spaces where we actually learn competition, we learn how to fail, we learn to succeed, and so forth and so on. So schools are very, and we also learn how to socialize. This is one of the first places where we start to make friends. Our peer groups, our friends, are also very important, and I'm sure you guys understand what peer pressure is. And the mass media is also crucially important in developing who we are as individuals. So let's talk about the first one, and that is the family. Now, as I said earlier here, the family is the most important agent of socialization. The family teaches us values and norms that shape our identity, shape the sense of ourselves. And one of the questions that I typically ask my students is at what age are parents no longer responsible for the actions of their kids? At what age would you say, you know what, if a kid goes out and robs a store, or if a kid goes out and does something wrong or deviant, at what age should a parent be still held responsible? And in my classes, there are always interest in answers or interest in responses to that question. The other agent of socialization, as I said earlier, is schools. And as I said, schools not only provide us with education, but they also allow us and provide us spaces where we make friends, hard work, competition, and so forth and so on. So schools are very important, and particularly if you go on in college and graduate school, we spend a lot of time in schools. So this is why it's an important agent of socialization. Another important agent of socialization are our friends. And what's interesting, research actually shows that as children get older, their friends become more important than their parents. But what's interesting is when they hit young adulthood, and I would argue that young adulthood would be 21, 22, and so forth and so on, around that time, parents then actually revert to becoming more important than friends. So it's quite interesting. Now, I don't know if that applies to you guys, but it's quite interesting in terms of the importance of friends. And we know that peer pressure is an important aspect of friendship. And so we know that the people we interact with can influence who we are as individuals. And so this is why we have to be careful at times who we interact with, because our friends do influence our decisions, do influence how we view ourselves and how we view other people. All right, now the last agent of socialization that we're going to talk about is that of the mass media, and the mass media is a very important agent of socialization. Now, the mass media refers to electronic instruments of communication that carry messages to widespread audience. And when we're talking about widespread audience, we mean millions, hundreds of millions of people. So the mass media is a very powerful tool that we use to communicate. Now, when we're talking about the mass media, we're talking about magazines, we're talking about newspapers, movies, social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok. All of these would be examples of the mass media. And you can think about how powerful these instruments are in terms of carrying information. And what's interesting is that a lot of people don't understand the power that the media has. It is very powerful. It shapes how we view ourselves. It shapes how we view other people. And it determines a lot. Now, as far as it being an agent of socialization, we're not going to get too much into it. This is actually going to be the last slide. But what I do want to tell you here is that the mass media is a very powerful agent of socialization. The mass media tells us who we should or should not be. And one of the things that the media does is that it ties consumption to our self-identity. Because one of the most important functions of the mass media is to sell you something, to sell you a product. So for example, Instagram, Facebook, they make money by selling you stuff, by advertising, right? And so this is why businesses will pay Facebook money to go on their platform to advertise, because they know that they can reach widespread audiences, and eventually those people are going to make the companies and the businesses money. And so these media outlets are very important. And again, like as I said before, it teaches us a lot of things. It teaches us about, beauty. It teaches us what is attractive and what is not. And what happens if you're not attractive. We know that the media ignores people who are not defined as beautiful and so forth and so on. So there's a lot of things that the media does. It teaches us about culture. As a matter of fact, this is the media, the mass media is probably one of the main spaces where we learn about other cultures. And this is why, as I, encourage you guys in the last chapter to travel. If you have the opportunity to travel, I encourage you to travel, because the mass media, if you rely on the mass media to teach you about culture, it can be very biased. It can be very warped. And so this is why when you travel and you have those firsthand experiences, you'll get to learn a lot more as opposed to just watching a movie. The mass media also teaches us about race. Problem a lot of times with the mass media in terms of what it teaches us about race is that a lot of these lessons are very stereotypical. And so again, this is why if you want to know something, you have to experience it yourself. So if you want to learn about somebody else's race or another race, meet people from different races as opposed to relying on what you see in the mass media. Because again, the mass media, even though it's a very important institution, it does have a lot of problems in terms of some of the bias and some of the things that we learn from our exposure to the mass media. Now, that is it for our chapter. I want to thank you guys, and I'll see you in the next chapter.